In the early months of 1945, German panzer crews still carried themselves with the confidence of men who had once terrorized the battlefields of Europe. They had grown accustomed to the weight of their massive Tiger tanks, the thunder of their 88mm guns, and the knowledge that few Allied weapons could penetrate their thick frontal armor. For years, these steel fortresses had been synonymous with German armored superiority. When enemy shells bounced harmlessly off their plates, when smaller Allied tanks fled at the sight of their approach, the crews felt invincible. They had been told repeatedly that their Tigers were the finest fighting machines ever built, engineered with precision that no enemy could match. But by early 1945, the war had shifted in ways that many German tankers refused to acknowledge. The Reich was shrinking, supplies were dwindling, and the industrial might of America was flooding Europe with new weapons and equipment. Among these arrivals was a tank that would shatter the confidence of Tiger crews in ways they never imagined possible. The M26 Pershing, armed with a 90mm gun, was rolling toward the front lines, carrying with it the power to rewrite the rules of armored combat. Most German crews had never heard of the Pershing. Intelligence reports were scarce, communication between units was breaking down, and the chaos of retreat left little time for studying enemy developments. To them, the American threat remained what it had always been: the reliable but unremarkable Sherman tank with its 75mm gun that posed little danger to a properly positioned Tiger. The Germans had grown so accustomed to this dynamic that they approached engagements with American armor almost casually, confident that their superior firepower and protection would carry the day. The shock would come not in grand battles or carefully planned engagements, but in sudden, brutal encounters where German crews discovered that their invincibility was an illusion. The first meetings between Tigers and Pershings were not the decisive clashes that military historians might expect. Instead, they were confused, chaotic moments where experienced German tankers found themselves staring at smoking holes punched clean through armor they had trusted with their lives. The 90mm gun of the Pershing delivered a revelation that no amount of training or propaganda had prepared them for. What made these encounters so devastating was not just the technical superiority of the American weapon, but the psychological impact on crews who had built their entire sense of security around the belief that nothing could touch them. For months, German tankers had been the hunters, stalking Allied armor across the battlefields of France and Belgium. Suddenly, they found themselves the hunted, facing an enemy that could strike with lethal precision at ranges they had thought safe. The transformation was swift and merciless. Tiger crews who had once advanced boldly into battle began to hesitate, to second-guess their positioning, to wonder whether that distant silhouette on the horizon might be something more dangerous than another helpless Sherman. The confidence that had carried them through years of combat began to crack under the weight of a new reality. Their Tigers, once symbols of German engineering superiority, were no longer the apex predators of the battlefield. The stories that emerged from these early encounters spread through German armored units like wildfire. Crews whispered about Tigers found abandoned with perfectly round holes punched through their thickest armor. Veterans who had survived Kursk and Normandy spoke in hushed tones about American guns that could reach out and kill at distances that seemed impossible. The mythology of Tiger invincibility, carefully constructed through years of propaganda and battlefield success, began to unravel one engagement at a time. But the full scope of this transformation was not immediately apparent to German high command, or even to the crews themselves. The Pershing was still relatively rare in early 1945, appearing in small numbers scattered across different units. Many German tankers would never encounter one directly, relying instead on second-hand reports and rumors that seemed too extreme to believe. Some dismissed the stories as panic or exaggeration from crews who had simply been outmaneuvered or caught in vulnerable positions. The reality was far more serious than these skeptics understood. The 90mm gun represented a fundamental shift in the balance of armored warfare, one that would strip away the tactical advantages German crews had enjoyed for years. Where once they could engage American tanks with confidence, knowing their armor would protect them from return fire, they now faced an enemy that could match their firepower and penetrate their defenses with devastating effect. The psychological warfare was as important as the technical capabilities. German crews who had grown comfortable with their dominance suddenly found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never experienced. The sound of an incoming 90mm round was different from the familiar crack of a 75mm Sherman gun. It carried with it the promise of destruction, the knowledge that their thick steel plates might not be enough to save them. Training and doctrine had not prepared German tankers for this new reality. Their tactics had been built around the assumption of armor superiority, relying on the ability to absorb punishment while delivering devastating counterattacks. When that fundamental advantage disappeared, experienced crews found themselves improvising desperately, trying to adapt years of battlefield knowledge to a situation that had never existed before. The impact extended beyond individual engagements to affect entire unit strategies. German commanders who had once positioned their Tigers aggressively, using them as mobile fortresses to anchor defensive lines, began to adopt more cautious approaches. The luxury of standing and fighting was replaced by the necessity of movement and concealment, tactics that played to the strengths of lighter, more mobile vehicles rather than the massive Tigers. Some crews adapted quickly, recognizing the new threat and modifying their behavior accordingly. They learned to identify the distinctive silhouette of the Pershing at long range, to avoid the direct confrontations that had once been routine, and to exploit whatever advantages their experience and positioning could provide. Others, trapped by years of habit and doctrine, continued to fight as they always had, often with fatal consequences. The transformation was not just tactical, but deeply personal. Tank crews formed tight bonds forged in the crucible of combat, and the loss of invulnerability affected these relationships in profound ways. Men who had once joked about bouncing enemy shells off their armor fell silent as they realized their survival now depended on luck as much as skill. The easy confidence that had characterized German armored units began to give way to a more desperate, calculating approach to combat. As word of the Pershing's capabilities spread through German ranks, the psychological impact rippled far beyond the crews who actually encountered them. The mere knowledge that such a weapon existed changed how German tankers approached every engagement, wondering whether that distant muzzle flash might be their last sight. The fear was not just of death, but of the realization that their technological superiority, the foundation of their tactical confidence, had been decisively challenged. The encounters between German Tigers and American Pershings in early 1945 represented more than just the collision of two different tanks. They marked the moment when German armored crews discovered that the war had changed in ways they had not anticipated, that their enemies had evolved beyond the predictable threats they had learned to handle. The 90mm gun was not just a weapon, it was a statement that the balance of power had shifted, and that the hunters might very well become the hunted. The first documented encounter between a Tiger and a Pershing occurred on February 26, 1945, near the German town of Elsdorf. The Tiger crew, commanded by Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner, had positioned their massive tank hull down behind a low ridge, using terrain that had served them well in countless previous engagements. Brenner was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had survived 3 years of combat by understanding the capabilities of his machine and the limitations of his enemies. He had knocked out dozens of Soviet T-34s and American Shermans, always relying on the same proven formula. Let the enemy come within range, absorb their ineffective fire, then deliver a devastating response with the legendary 88mm gun. That morning, Brenner spotted what he assumed was another Sherman moving through the valley below. The silhouette was similar, the size roughly comparable, and nothing in his experience suggested he should treat this target any differently than the hundreds of others he had engaged. He ordered his gunner to take aim, confident that a single well-placed shot would end the encounter, as it always had. The American tank was approximately 800 meters away, well within the effective range of the Tiger's main gun, but still far enough that Brenner felt completely secure behind his thick frontal armor. What happened next shattered every assumption Brenner had built over years of combat. Before his gunner could fire, the American tank's gun erupted in a flash of flame and smoke. The round struck the Tiger's turret with a sound unlike anything Brenner had ever heard. Instead of the familiar ping of a deflected shell or the dull thud of a round absorbed by thick steel, there was a sharp, metallic crack, followed by the screech of metal tearing apart. The 90mm projectile punched through the Tiger's frontal turret armor as if it were paper, sending white-hot fragments ricocheting around the fighting compartment. Brenner's gunner was killed instantly, his body torn apart by spalling and shell fragments. The loader, a boy of barely 18 who had joined the crew only weeks earlier, screamed as molten metal seared his face and hands. Brenner himself was thrown against the commander's cupola, his ears ringing from the concussion, blood streaming from a dozen small wounds where steel fragments had found their mark. In the space of a single second, his invincible Tiger had been transformed from a predator into a tomb. The surviving crew members abandoned the tank immediately, stumbling through the smoke and chaos as secondary explosions began to cook off ammunition stored in the turret. Brenner looked back once as they fled, seeing his Tiger burning fiercely, black smoke pouring from the commander's hatch. The perfectly round hole in the turret front told the story more clearly than any after-action report ever could. Something had fundamentally changed on the battlefield, and the rules he had lived by for 3 years no longer applied. Similar scenes played out across the Western Front as more Pershings arrived and German crews encountered them in combat. Each engagement followed a similar pattern of shock and devastation. Tiger commanders who had grown accustomed to methodical, almost leisurely engagements found themselves facing an enemy that could kill them at the first exchange of fire. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Veteran crews who had once approached combat with the confidence of men driving nearly unstoppable machines began to exhibit signs of stress and hesitation that had never been present before. Hauptmann Werner Stolz commanded a company of Tigers defending a strategic crossroads near Cologne when he first encountered multiple Pershings in a coordinated attack. Stolz was an experienced officer who had led armored units since the early days of the war, and his tactical knowledge was built on the foundation of Tiger superiority. He positioned his tanks in mutually supporting positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that had proven devastatingly effective against Sherman attacks. His crews were veterans, men who had fought together for months and understood the capabilities of their machines intimately. The American attack began at dawn, with what appeared to be a standard Sherman assault supported by infantry. Stolz's Tigers engaged the leading elements at long range, expecting to decimate the attacking force before it could close to effective firing distance. The first few shots went as expected, with Sherman tanks erupting in flames as 88mm rounds found their marks. But as the engagement developed, Stolz realized that some of the American tanks were different. They were firing back with devastating accuracy, and their rounds were not bouncing harmlessly off his Tiger's armor. Within minutes, two of Stoltz's tanks were burning wrecks, their crews either dead or fleeing across the battlefield. A third Tiger had taken a hit that penetrated its side armor, killing the driver and wounding the commander. The survivors found themselves in a situation they had never experienced before, outgunned and vulnerable despite occupying strong defensive positions. Stoltz ordered a withdrawal, something that would have been unthinkable in any previous engagement with American armor. The retreat itself became a nightmare, as Pershing crews demonstrated that their 90mm guns were equally effective at long range. Tigers that had once been able to disengage at will found themselves being stalked and hunted across open ground. The Americans showed a tactical sophistication that surprised the German crews, using their mobility and firepower advantage to prevent the Tigers from reaching safe positions. What had begun as a confident defense ended as a desperate flight, with German tanks abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the rear areas. The reports that filtered back to German high command painted a picture that many officers refused to believe. Experienced Tiger crews, men who had been the backbone of German armored units for years, were describing encounters with American tanks that seemed to possess impossible capabilities. The 90mm gun was reportedly capable of penetrating Tiger armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, distances at which German crews had felt completely secure. Intelligence officers dismissed many of these reports as exaggeration or panic, unwilling to accept that the technological balance had shifted so dramatically. But the evidence continued to accumulate with each passing day. Destroyed Tigers were found with characteristic round holes punched through their thickest armor plates. Crews who survived encounters with Pershings described the distinctive sound of the 90mm gun, deeper and more ominous than the crack of Sherman cannons. Veterans who had never shown fear in combat spoke in hushed tones about American tanks that could reach out and kill with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The transformation in German tactical doctrine was swift and dramatic. Units that had once relied on the Tiger's superiority to anchor their defensive positions began adopting more fluid, mobile tactics. Commanders who had grown comfortable with static warfare found themselves forced to embrace the kind of rapid movement and concealment that had once been the domain of lighter vehicles. The psychological adjustment was perhaps even more difficult than the tactical one, as crews struggled to adapt to their new vulnerability. Training programs attempted to address the new threat, but the reality was that there was little that could be done to improve the Tiger's protection against the Pershing's gun. Instead, crews were taught to avoid direct confrontations, to use terrain more effectively, and to rely on ambush tactics rather than the frontal assaults that had once been routine. The transformation was complete. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and the age of Tiger dominance was drawing to a close. The impact of these encounters extended far beyond the individual tank crews who experienced them firsthand. Word traveled through German armored units with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it a mixture of disbelief, fear, and desperate curiosity. Veteran sergeants who had seen their Tigers reduced to burning scrap metal found themselves surrounded by younger crew members hungry for details, trying to understand how their invincible machines had been so easily defeated. The stories grew in the telling, but even the most conservative accounts painted a picture that challenged everything German tankers thought they knew about armored warfare. In repair depots behind the lines, mechanics and engineers examined the wreckage of Tigers that had encountered Pershings, running their fingers along the edges of penetration holes that seemed impossibly clean and precise. The 90mm rounds had not simply battered their way through the steel, They had sliced through it with surgical precision, creating openings that spoke to a level of ballistic performance that German metallurgists had thought beyond American capabilities. Some of the holes were so perfectly round that they looked almost artificial, as if someone had used a massive drill rather than a high-velocity projectile. Technical reports began filtering up through the chain of command, but many senior officers remained skeptical of their contents. The idea that American industry had produced a tank gun capable of matching or exceeding the legendary 88mm cannon seemed preposterous to men who had been raised on the mythology of German technological superiority. Some dismissed the reports as propaganda designed to undermine morale. Others suggested that the Americans must have captured German guns and mounted them on their own tanks, unwilling to believe that enemy engineers could have developed such a weapon independently. But the evidence continued to accumulate with each passing week. Reconnaissance units reported sightings of American tanks with longer, heavier guns than the familiar Shermans. Prisoners of war spoke of new vehicles that their captors called Pershings, named after some American general they had never heard of. Intelligence photographs, when they could be obtained, showed tanks that bore a superficial resemblance to Shermans, but carried armament that was clearly different and more substantial. The psychological warfare aspect of the Pershing's arrival was perhaps as devastating as its physical capabilities. German crews who had never actually encountered the new American tank found themselves affected by the stories and rumors that circulated through their units. Men who had once slept soundly in their Tigers now found themselves starting at every distant engine noise, wondering whether the next engagement might be their last. The confidence that had sustained German armored units through years of combat began to erode, replaced by a wariness that affected everything from tactical decisions to personal morale. Training exercises took on a new urgency as commanders attempted to prepare their crews for an enemy that seemed to possess capabilities beyond anything they had previously faced. But how do you train men to fight an opponent whose weapon can penetrate your armor at any range? The traditional German approach of using superior firepower and protection to dominate the battlefield no longer applied when the enemy possessed equivalent or superior capabilities. Crews found themselves practicing evasion and concealment tactics that had once been the domain of lighter, more vulnerable vehicles. The strategic implications were equally profound. German defensive plans that had relied on Tigers to hold key positions suddenly seemed inadequate when those supposedly invulnerable tanks could be destroyed by long-range fire from American guns. Commanders who had grown comfortable with static defensive warfare found themselves forced to consider more mobile, fluid tactics that played against the strengths of their heavy armor. The entire doctrine of German armored warfare, built around the concept of technological superiority, was crumbling under the weight of American industrial innovation. Supply officers began receiving desperate requests for additional armor plating, upgraded protection, anything that might restore the Tiger's defensive advantage. But the reality was that Germany's industrial capacity was already stretched beyond its limits. The resources needed to significantly improve Tiger armor simply did not exist, and even if they had, the time required for research, development, and production was a luxury that the shrinking Reich could not afford. The war was moving too quickly for technological solutions to catch up with tactical problems. Field modifications became common as desperate crews attempted to improve their chances of survival. Some Tigers appeared with additional steel plates welded to their turrets and hulls, improvised armor that added weight without providing significant protection against the Pershing's powerful gun. Others were fitted with camouflage nets and foliage that made them harder to spot at long range, though this did little to help once they were detected. The modifications were more psychological than practical, giving crews the feeling that they were doing something to address the threat even when the actual benefit was minimal. Communication between units became increasingly important as commanders tried to share information about Pershing capabilities and tactics. Radio networks buzzed with reports of sightings, engagement ranges, and penetration data as German forces attempted to build a comprehensive picture of their new opponent. But the information was often contradictory or incomplete, filtered through the chaos of combat and the stress of crews who had survived encounters they never expected to live through. The impact on German morale extended beyond the armored units themselves. Infantry soldiers who had grown accustomed to the protective presence of Tigers found themselves questioning whether their heavy armor support could be relied upon in future engagements. Artillery observers who had coordinated with Tiger crews for months suddenly found their partners hesitant to take the aggressive positions that had once been routine. The ripple effects of the Pershing's arrival spread through the entire German military structure. In the end, the arrival of the Pershing's 90mm gun marked more than just a shift in armored capability. It represented the collapse of an entire mythology that had sustained German panzer crews through years of warfare. The invincible Tiger, once the terror of Allied forces, had been reduced to just another target on a battlefield where American industrial might finally match German engineering pride. For the crews who survived these encounters, the memory of that first penetrating shot would linger long after the war ended. A reminder that no armor, no matter how thick, could protect against the relentless march of innovation and the devastating power of a nation fully committed to victory.